The highest-ranking person in a room is rarely the one people actually choose to follow. Psychologists have spent decades studying why, and what they found challenges everything most organizations assume about leadership. Followership turns out to be entirely voluntary. It cannot be demanded, only earned, and the mechanism that earns it begins with a single psychological gate that most aspiring leaders never even see. In 1995, researchers Roger Mayer, James Davis, and David Shorman identified this gate as trust, defining it as an individual's willingness to be vulnerable to the actions of another. Their integrative model reveals that followers constantly evaluate potential leaders across three distinct dimensions: ability, benevolence, and integrity. In an everyday office, a mid-level manager demonstrates these traits not through grand pronouncements, but through mundane, predictable routines. Ability is signaled when a manager consistently makes reliable, high-quality decisions under pressure. Benevolence is shown when they protect an employee's workload, check in on their well-being, or actively advocate for their welfare. Integrity, the ultimate anchor of the model, is established when public statements align perfectly with private actions. According to organizational research, trust is highly cumulative, earned in small, repeated moments that are remembered during subsequent crises. These quiet routines build a willingness to be vulnerable far more effectively than formal authority alone. When employees perceive this consistent pattern of behavior, it lowers the psychological risk of cooperation. This steady accumulation of credibility explains why teams often bypass formal corporate titles, choosing instead to voluntarily commit their energy to a leader they trust. When stability collapses, followers shift from evaluating goodwill to demanding objective proof of capability. This transition is explained by Michael Spence's 1973 signaling theory, which suggests that visible, high-stakes behaviors serve as reliable indicators of otherwise hidden abilities. Under pressure, abstract reputation matters less than immediate, observable problem-solving. Followers watch how a leader manages stress because crisis conditions make competence highly legible. On June 4, 1940, following the military disaster at Dunkirk, Winston Churchill stood before the House of Commons. Britain faced a looming invasion and the loss of its continental allies. Instead of offering empty optimism, Churchill delivered a calm, highly detailed inventory of the nation's strategic reality. He acknowledged the rescue of over 300,000 troops, but plainly stated that evacuations do not win wars. By framing the crisis as a series of specific, manageable logistical challenges, including defending the beaches, maintaining the Navy, and preparing the Air Force, Churchill signaled that the government possessed both the strategic grasp and operational capacity to handle the threat. This precise, measured communication acted as a public competence cue, providing the evidence followers needed to voluntarily commit their efforts. Ultimately, followers must weigh both a leader's intent and their actual ability before they choose to face uncertainty together. Beneath strategic intent and ability lies a more immediate, visceral layer of connection. In 1990, Peter Salovey and John Mayer established a four-branch model of emotional intelligence, outlining how individuals perceive, use, understand, and regulate feelings. This framework explains how leaders manage the emotional climate of a group. Through emotional contagion, followers automatically mimic and internalize a leader's nonverbal cues, naturally mirroring genuine calm or confidence. A sports coach demonstrates this practical skill in a tense huddle. Rather than ignoring the pressure, the coach reads subtle shifts in player posture and gaze, recognizing anxiety before anyone speaks. By consciously modeling composure, the coach transmits stability to the team. This active regulation is far from sentimental. It is a tactical intervention that directly preserves morale and performance. By accurately reading and responding to these unspoken feelings, a leader prevents temporary pressure from fracturing collective cohesion. James McGregor Burns in 1978 and Bernard Bass in 1985 described this shift as the distinction between transactional and transformational leadership. While transactional models rely on direct exchanges of rewards for compliance, transformational leaders raise followers by appealing to shared values, prompting them to act past individual self-interest. This shift requires more than strategic clarity. It relies on moral authority, which increases commitment because the proposed direction feels ethically grounded. In his January 1968 address, Martin Luther King Jr. showed how leadership rhetoric can bind purpose and legitimacy by framing systemic inequalities as ethical challenges rather than policy failures. By invoking the arc of the moral universe and describing humanity as bound in a single garment of destiny, King bypassed simple persuasion, instead defining a future that people could vividly picture and wanted to help build. Transformational theory shows that vision succeeds when it feels both emotionally resonant and socially believable. When a leader establishes this ethical credibility, inspiration replaces mere persuasion, and followers choose to voluntarily align with a shared destination rather than a set of transactional demands. This collective alignment shifts the relationship from simple compliance to cooperative action. Social identity theory explains how a leader's language transforms personal conviction into collective effort. When individuals see their own values reflected in a message, they begin to categorize themselves as part of a coordinated collective. In grassroots organizing, this transition relies heavily on Robert Cialdini's principles of reciprocity and commitment. By starting with a small concrete request, an organizer establishes an initial loop of mutual support. This small step builds consistency. People feel a psychological drive to connect their subsequent behaviors with their new public identity. A successful organizer bypasses broad appeals, using highly specific and repeatable wording to outline immediate, everyday tasks. By framing these actions in terms of shared goals, they turn isolated actors into a cohesive we. This functional connection closes the loop between passive agreement and active participation, showing that voluntary cooperation is built on clear language and mutual obligation instead of personal charm. In 1977, Robert K. Greenleaf proposed an organizational model that inverted the traditional hierarchy, servant leadership. This model begins with the natural feeling that one wants to serve first, rather than lead. Influence is earned not through self-display or demanded loyalty, but through deliberate listening, stewardship, and a commitment to employee growth. Instead of asserting top-down power, the leader acts as a supportive resource, placing the needs of followers ahead of personal status or organizational ambition. This service-oriented approach establishes a cooperative environment that researcher Amy Edmondson termed psychological safety. In her 1999 study of work teams, Edmondson defined this safety as a shared belief that a team is safe for interpersonal risk-taking, where individuals will not be humiliated or punished for speaking up with ideas, questions, or mistakes. Her field research showed that this safety is the strongest predictor of team learning and performance, outweighing team composition or resource levels. When leaders prioritize active support and vulnerability over punishment, they lower the psychological cost of participation. Followers contribute honestly because the fear of negative consequences is removed. Emotional intelligence, in this context, serves as the practical discipline that keeps service effective, allowing leaders to read group needs accurately and regulate the emotional climate to support collective learning. However, the very mechanisms that build this alignment also introduce risks. Because servant leadership relies on voluntary vulnerability, it is highly susceptible to exploitation when influence is detached from objective accountability. When a leader's charisma outruns their ethical guardrails, the tools of trust building can be weaponized. Followers primed by genuine benevolence and a sense of shared community may gradually suspend their critical judgment. Without structural checks and balances, a leader's apparent selflessness can mask self-serving manipulation. Influence detached from responsibility ceases to be genuine leadership. It becomes a tool of control, showing that the psychological pathways to followership require constant ethical calibration to prevent devotion from turning into blind obedience. As modern institutions face a crisis of trust, the limits of formal power have never been clearer. Real leadership remains a quiet psychological contract, earned through empathy and competence. We ultimately follow those who understand us, not those who command us. Share your thoughts in the comments.